Hello and you're welcome to the Big Tech Show with me, Adrian Weckler, the tech editor of the Irish and Sunday Independent. Now, I want to ask you a few questions. A, do you want to work from home in future? B, do you want to work in the job you have, maybe, but do it remotely from another country? And then more generally, do you think that working from home is our long-term future or even a partial work from home future? Well, I'm joined by a couple of people to discuss this today. Dee Coakley is the CEO of Boundless, and Ellie Donnelly is my colleague in the Irish Independent, business reporter. You're both welcome to the podcast.
Thank you, Adrian.
Dee, this week, Facebook said that it is going to allow its staff to do two things. One, to work from home, to apply to work from home for good if they want. And two, a portion of them will be allowed to work abroad outside Ireland for the first time. Do you think this is generally a sign of things to come in our working lives?
Absolutely. There was a huge movement in this direction before COVID, and we founded our business, which is an international employment and payroll platform. We founded it probably about a year before COVID, and we founded it in response to this big movement of workers being more mobile. Now, it was fairly focused on the tech sector at that point in time. I myself had a background in the tech sector and had handled these challenges and knew that there was huge demand for a solution. What we have seen over the last year is that we are now talking to companies in all kinds of sectors: manufacturing, energy, media companies. There are companies across the board that maybe were reluctant to embrace this before, but they're now either feeling that they're being pushed in that direction due to employee demand, or they found that remote has worked really well for them over the last year, and they're starting to have it form part of their strategy around their people.
Okay, I'm going to get into some of the bigger implications of that later on, but I'll just ask you off the top. Does that mean that we're going to see, if not a clear out, a thinning out of the tech scene in Dublin, which is a very big employment scene in Dublin?
I think we need to remember that there are huge numbers of people from all over the world that want to work remotely from where they're working right now, and where they want to go to is Dublin. We employ many Irish people, or not necessarily Irish people, people from other countries who have come here to work for European and US tech companies. We have some company founders, US company founders, that have relocated to Ireland during the pandemic. So there's movement. People are moving right now. People are moving all over the world, and they were throughout the pandemic. A lot of people made country moves during that time. We're going to see a lot more of it, but in and out, I think.
Okay, so it swings and roundabouts. Ellie, can you just briefly explain what your working setup is at the moment?
I'm lucky in a way that my flatmate moved out just before the pandemic hit, and the landlord was quite relaxed, because at that point we just thought this is just going to be a few weeks. So he was very much, you can have the spare room and that's the office. So I think I'm one of the more fortunate ones in that I actually have a spare room office. But it means, I am in the apartment all the time. I'm living on my own, and that could be tricky sometimes. I think one of the disadvantages in my case from working from home is the casual learning that you would pick up in an office environment that you just don't get at all from working from home. So say it might be overhearing somebody dealing with a problem that or experience that when it comes up, then in time, you may encounter that same problem, and you just don't really have that previous learning experience to deal with it, especially for people in the early stages of their careers, or even like if you're having a bad day, you can ring your friends or you can ring your flatmates or talk to your flatmates, but they may not necessarily know kind of how that is working for you or why that is the case, because unless they work in the same industry, very often they can't really relate to it. Whereas I think when you're in an office environment, it's very easy in a situation like that to grab somebody for tea for 10 minutes, talk it through, and then suddenly you're like, oh, actually, it's grand now. Whereas working from home without that kind of interaction of your colleagues, you're like, oh God, this is just the worst thing in the world. So In some respects, yeah, it's okay. But I think going forwards, I would definitely be in the camp of wanting a hybrid workplace. And I think the casual learning that you get from an office environment is so invaluable, regardless of what stage of your career that you're at. But in particular, if you're in the early stages of your career, that whole mentorship is an awful lot easier to have in place in an environment. And I think it is really, really key, particularly, as I said, for younger members of staff with perhaps less experience.
So even if you could work in another country, and I'm sure in our fantasies, we all have a list of places that we might like to try working from for a while. I know that you like to travel as well, but even if you could work in another country, say in the job you're in at the moment, for example, would you want to do it from an apartment, or would you want to be in an office situation there?
I think a hybrid, I really do. I think, yeah, it's handy sometimes when, you're waiting on something that's being delivered to your house, or you just can't face a commute. Obviously, the working from home, it's got a lot of advantages. I would imagine for parents at times, it's got an awful lot more advantages. But as I said, it goes back to that learning environment. I do think that there is a nice thing to be in that structured place where you can just grab somebody and say, hey, what's your thoughts on this? Rather than sending an email, picking up the phone. It's just that time issue comes into it as well. Sometimes it's just so much easier to get something done in an office environment. It's so much easier to discuss a problem and just to get a quick answer. And sometimes you just need an answer like that. And if you're waiting on an email response or waiting on somebody to ring you back, it just delays it and drags things out.
Yeah. Dee, if kind of more distributed working or remote working world becomes a reality, and maybe with a cross-border element as well, what do you think, not to get too deep, but what do you think that might mean for cities as we know them?
I think it's going to have a huge impact. Like we must remember that, of course, there are lots of organizations that will revert to the office. And there are certain sectors and organizations where they need to have people co-located. There are also lots of reasons why organizations might have individuals based in specific countries or one country. So it's, we're not looking at a future here where it's all change and suddenly everyone is working from remote locations. But we're in a transitionary period. We're about to see, or are in the middle of seeing, huge changes happen as a result of everything that's happened across the world over the last 14 months. How we work and where we work from are just two of the components or elements of change. And I dare say that as the world evolves and the other changes in other aspects of our lives that we see that are linked to the pandemic, they will also further inform more change in how we work. In the remote work world, there was definitely, amongst people that have been involved in remote work for quite a few years, there would definitely be an acknowledgement and appreciation that effective remote work is very, very different to what most of us have seen over the last 14 months. What we were seeing over the last 14 months was emergency remote work. And in an ideal world, an organization, if they are to have a distributed team, the organization will be set up as remote first. And our organization is a remote first business. One of my co-founders is Irish but lives in France. We always knew we were going to be a distributed team. And our team are across 8 countries. We established processes, styles of communication, ways of collaborating that are very aligned with this type of working and very aligned with not being in an office together. Now, I personally am a huge fan of in-person collaboration. I believe there's huge value in it. When we founded the company, we always said that we would have regular team retreats. We were thinking it would probably be every 10 months or so. Obviously, that hasn't been possible. But an organization like ours, we have structures, processes, ways of communicating that mean that you're removing a lot of those friction points that you see if you take what's happening in the office and try to apply it to Zoom, email and Slack.
But isn't that Tim Cook's point? I mean, Tim Cook from Apple, the absolute polar opposite to what Facebook is saying. Tim Cook told Apple's 6,000 employees in Cork last week, I really want you back in the office in September. And for many of the reasons that you're articulating now, that it's just more creative, it's a better environment. And that's what makes us who we are.
Yeah, and collaboration, in-person collaboration, there's something magic about that. Depending on the nature of your organization and the types of roles that people are in, that form of collaboration isn't always a daily activity. It can be in some organizations. And for those, they will need to have people co-located, or at least some of their teams co-located. But this culture of remote working and distributed teams, it really started with software engineers. Software engineers are allocated work that they'll use software tools that break down the pieces of work that everyone is due to do. And people are given what's called a ticket. They'll have a piece of work to work on. They go away, they work on that on their own. They mark it as complete when it's done, move on to the next piece of work. It's work that works very, very well from a quiet space where you are quite isolated. And, you know, for anyone like me who's an operations person coming into a software environment, when you first start working, and you know, for me, that was 12, 13 years ago. But when you first start working in this environment, it seems very strange because these people are siloed. They're sitting alone at their desks. They may all be in
huge headphones.
And everyone communicates through the likes of Slack, or, you know, when I started working in tech, it was Skype Messenger. People don't talk to each other. This thing of having a quick question, that is considered very bad form and etiquette in a software engineering type environment. You don't go and tap someone on the shoulder because you'll break their concentration.
Well, let me tell you, there's some journalists like that as well. And by the way, I myself, I'm not a million miles away from that. So I sit quite close to Ellie, and in our little space, there are some who love a little bit of, you know, banter and a bit of chat. There are some who are middling, which I'd count myself, will partake in some banter, sometimes have the headphones on. And then there are one or two that just don't come near me, you know, which is totally fine. That's, and I think you're describing, I think it would be an extreme to call them misanthropes, but it's toward that. I know what you mean.
Yeah. And you know, the reality is, we are now seeing a world where flexibility is what everyone wanted before the pandemic. But we are potentially seeing a world now where your work style and where you work from and how you work can be matched to your personality type and your preferred style of working. And now if companies are hiring based on certain types of skills that are needed for certain roles, and they make sure that match is there and the style of working is there, you are going to see a society where there are far more happy people. There are some people where their idea of hell is going to an office every day.
That's often how the narrative is framed, I have to tell you. When you turn on the radio at the weekend or during the day, people are typically talking heads. Ellie, I'm not sure if you'd agree with this. The talking heads that you normally hear on this topic are people who are in their 40s or 50s, and they have their lives set up. They have families, they have associations, they have a suburban house with a front and a back garden. They don't want to go to nightclubs. They don't want to meet new people. They're not necessarily looking for an instant promotion in their career. And they're very, very happy just to sit in their spare room or out in the back garden. And they don't have the same imperative to meet new people, to learn, as you were talking about earlier.
Yeah, agreed. And I think as well, like that's one thing that we go back to is the space issue. Then, you know, for a lot of people, you know, there's no back garden in this apartment complex. You just, you get on with it. And the balcony is the outdoor space. And yeah, the living room now is my gym. It's my canteen. It has been for the past 15 months. And it is, I find it more difficult. And maybe that's just the world that we're living in now, where your work is fundamentally on your phone for an awful lot of people. But it is harder to switch off when, you know, to leave the office on a Friday evening is just to close the door in one room, and then you walk into the living room and that's it. And you're supposed to kind of, it's an awful lot harder. And I would be somebody who would quite often walk or cycle to and from the office, and just having that space that kind of forces you in the mornings of like guaranteed 30 minutes of fresh air before I got into the office. And you can say, okay, I can do that now. And in my case, I start work every day around 6:30 roughly. I set my alarm every morning at 5:30. And if I get up and take fresh air once in that week, I'm doing really, really well. Because whereas when I worked in the office, it was that, well, I have to be somewhere at 6:30 in the morning. And so it's an awful lot easier to hop up on the bike then. And that's another element of it that, yeah, you can say, oh, I have way more time in theory to take exercise. But another thing as well, when you're working from home, nobody can physically see that you're still working at 4:00 in the evening. So there's nobody there that's going to be like, you need to get out of here. You're doing it on yourself. So it is harder at times to find that 20 or 30 minutes of me time for the exercise before or after work at times.
These are all good points. Dee, some of the rest of the discussion I find is framed not unreasonably in the sense of what employees and staff would prefer and what they would like. And I sometimes wonder whether that is in a bit of a bubble in the tech industry, because the tech industry is still a boom industry. It is very low in employment. In general, staff can they can write their own tickets in many respects. It's not unusual for someone to disagree with an ethical position, for example, that their company might have on a service that they're providing to somebody, and just quit because they know they'll have another job in 3 or 4 weeks. It might be an exceptional industry in that regard and not wholly representative. Do you think?
Yeah, I think that's all fair, Adrian. And when you say, I mean, if someone's a software engineer, they will literally have a job within 24 hours. It's not 3 or 4 weeks. I've often interviewed a software engineer, call the next day to offer the job, and they say, "Oh, I went to another interview after yours, and they gave me a contract in the interview." That happens a lot in London.
And by the way, good for them. By the way,
but I think it's fair to say that the tech sector, relatively speaking, has a very loud voice relative to its size when it comes to the media. And it's very, very true that we hear a lot from the tech sector about this. And when we talk about remote work, there are a lot of references to the Facebooks and the Apples of the world and so on. But we're definitely seeing this across lots of other sectors. And there certainly, they might not be they don't have the public profile maybe of these other companies, but there are certainly organizations that have, hundreds or thousands, tens of thousands of employees that are currently busy working on their long-term strategy around remote work, and quite often around international remote work. And they are making moves in this direction for sure. Now, we don't know what proportion of all sectors or what proportion of all jobs are potentially looking at being remote. Nobody knows that. We just don't have.
Google thinks it'll be a fifth, and Facebook thinks it might be as much as half. Apple, on the other hand, is trying its best to make sure it's much lower than that. The data points here will be very interesting. Within 18 months, we should have an idea as to which system is working out better in terms of which companies are more productive, and therefore which firms are setting the agenda, which are the more successful companies and which are the lesser, the least successful companies in that regard. I just want to ask you, either of you, if you talk to somebody, the guy in the street, the woman on the street about this, in terms of working abroad, for example, I'm wondering what impact that might have, and I'm going back to Facebook now, on things like rents, house prices, the local economy. Even if you don't work abroad, let's say remote working takes off. I'm thinking of Indeed, which told all of its staff they could work from home. I know somebody who, on the strength of that, went home to her home county of Waterford and bought a house there, now lives there and works for Indeed. What effect does that have on things like rents and housing and the economy in Dublin?
Yeah, I mean, if you talk to any estate agents around the country, they are selling houses to people who are moving down from Dublin. I personally know quite a few people who've done that. You have to imagine that eventually it may have some impact on housing prices here. There is such pent-up demand.
If you just take the top line figures, let's take Facebook. Facebook employs, believe it or not, 6,000 people now in Dublin. I thought it was 3,000 or 4,000. It's actually 6,000. I checked this morning. Let's say 10% of Facebook's 6,000 employees go to live in France or Spain or Germany or Holland or any one of the 7 countries that they will be allowed to live in and still work for Facebook here in Dublin. That's 600 people, probably paid higher than average. And that's 600 potential apartments or houses that come up for availability. Now imagine the same thing happens with Google. Google employs 8,000 people. All of a sudden, you might have 1,000, 2,000 units that come up for availability.
Certainly, those kinds of numbers to me sound very realistic, that you may see that number of people leaving from those organizations. Bear in mind that during the pandemic, a lot of Irish people living abroad have also had an existential crisis. And there are lots of people who are looking at moving home. Those people now have access to high quality, high paid remote work for US companies, European companies, perhaps the company and the job that they're currently in, and they can live in Ireland. And
are you seeing much of that?
Yeah, we are. Lots of it. I mean, many people, certainly every week we hear quite a lot. We sell to the employer, that's our customer, but we do get a lot of inquiries, particularly from Irish people, because we obviously have Irish connections, who are currently looking at making that move back home, and they're trying to convince their employer, or they've applied for a job and they're trying to convince that employer that they can be easily employed in Ireland. There's a lot of movement coming that direction as well.
Yeah.
What I've heard from, there's two kind of groups I could put my friends into. There's the ones that have been like, I'm never going to be able to afford in Dublin, and this is really hammering that home for me, who are very slowly looking at moving down the country, but I'm talking still got to rent in Dublin for another year or so and see how it goes. And then there's the other half who, because there was the restrictions, particularly in the early days, have become so incredibly familiar with their local area, because there was not a whole lot to do except go for walks in the local park, that have now decided that the exact area they live in Dublin, that's the area that they want to buy in, and that they don't really want to look. They want to not just stay in Dublin, but stay in this one particular area.
Stockholm syndrome. Stockholm syndrome,
exactly, is what's happening. And there's 3 or 4 friends that I've spoke to about it, and they say, no, this is the exact area, the one that I'm in now is where I want to stay. Because
isn't that interesting how that happens when you live somewhere for a while, and it's maybe not somewhere you would have thought of ultimately settling down, but then you kind of get to become familiar with it and you actually grow to quite like it.
And that's their thing. They know every shop owner now. They're on really good terms with every shop owner. They know every park or all the people hanging out in the park, because this has been their bubble, if you like, for the last year and a half. This has been the only place that they could be fundamentally, and they're like, no, this is where we want.
Hopefully you're talking about here in the north side.
It did. That was one of the places. Yeah.
One of the places.
That's one. Sorry.
I kind of pausing whether or not to bring this into the conversation or not, because it's a separate discussion. But one of the things that I dislike about conversations of big tech companies and property and that sort of stuff in Dublin is, if you scratch the surface in a heated discussion about it, you're never that far away from somebody saying, what good is all these foreign workers coming over here and, putting pressure on the housing supply. I see it all the time when I report on new jobs announcements, for example, from the multinationals. 1 in 3 responses on social media will always be great. So now it'll even be more unaffordable in the place that I grew up in. And I'm wondering whether this might be an inadvertent safety valve on that kind of ugly expression, whether maybe a drive towards remote working, some people moving to totally out of choice to other cities down the country, maybe even to other countries, might be a very fortunate self-correcting tool, and basically lets the government off the hook here, by the way, because it's a terrible indictment on the lack of ambition for Dublin that these issues end up, creating this kind of tension anyway.
Yeah, we're certainly going to see some kind of stabilizing, and I'm looking at this from an international perspective because of what I do, and we are seeing more and more people in very well-paid roles living in rural areas, and this is international. It's not just in Ireland. That has quite an impact on a local economy. I'm involved with an organisation called Grow Remote here in Ireland that now has chapters in countries across the world. And they are focused on, it's a not-for-profit, focused on encouraging remote work as a means to support rural areas and to create thriving local communities through having people in well-paid jobs in these communities. Now, some of those people might not be originally from that area, but generally, if someone's moving to a rural area, that's a lifestyle choice. They're doing it because they want to connect with people locally. They want to get involved. They want to send their kids to the local school. They maybe want to coach at the local kids' GAA, whatever it is. Those things are great for a local community. And if those people and those families are bringing incomes that are a multiple of what's generally seen locally for work locally, that is a few families like that moving into an area with a small population can have a really great impact. So it's certainly something, that kind of stabilizing aspect of having people moving to the rural areas with their higher incomes, freeing up perhaps property for people to move into Dublin who might not be on quite such high incomes. This could be a very positive thing, but it's, it's movement internationally, not just across Ireland. So a lot of the outcomes will depend on what happens in other countries also.
And can you relate to that? Do you live rurally?
I live in Dublin.
Yeah.
I am currently looking to buy a place in the west of Ireland.
Huh.
I do think I'll be splitting my time. But I used to travel a lot. I don't see myself traveling as much now after this pandemic. I lived abroad for years. I lived abroad for about 14, 15 years. I'm very happy here now, so I don't see myself leaving anytime soon. But I like to know that I have the option. And, my colleagues, myself and my co-founder, Eamon, who you know, Adrian, we are, I think, the only two people in our company who actually live in the country that we were originally from. We have a very international team, people across 8 countries, but most people are living in a country that's not where they grew up. So
you'll never take, I don't care where he lives, you'll never take the Dubliner out of Eamon Leonard.
That's very true. I don't think he has any plans to move to the country.
So where would you consider? Would you? I'm going to make a pitch here for Belmullet in County Mayo.
I've been having that pitch from my aunt as well. My parents are both from Mayo.
Ah.
Belmullet seems a little far from Dublin for me.
Belmullet is the unfashed. Belmullet's the north side of Mayo, which makes it very, very. I'm very comfortable there. It's not the D4, or Mayo 4, which is down around Lewisburg, Westport, where a lot of people gravitate towards, for understandable reasons. Spectacular scenery, nice services there as well. But you get a few other things up in the north of the county that you don't quite get in south. Anyway, but well, that sounds like an exciting plan. Anyway, so you're kind of living what you're preaching as well.
Choice. I am looking. Yeah. I'm looking at almost everywhere coastal, but Mayo is top of the list.
What about you, Ellie? What's your where would be your preference if you won the lottery tomorrow, or you became, editor of the Irish Independent and you were allowed to live anywhere? Where would you live?
Am I restricted to Ireland, or can I live?
No, anywhere.
Oh, I would go back and live in Melbourne. I spent almost 2 years there, and there's a reason it's constantly top 3 most livable cities in the world. It is phenomenal. If you're anyway into sport, and I'm a lot into sport, it is the best city for sport. It's the best. It's great for food. It's great for everything. Sorry, I
wow.
We can employ you around us. So no problems for the Independent, Ellie. Tell them.
Yeah. Bit of a time zone issue, maybe. But
slight time zone issue, but yeah, that would be where I'd be tomorrow in the heart.
Also, and I just have to say, I'm not sure this is make the cut in the podcast, but you're in a Liverpool stronghold there. Melbourne is a big Liverpool sporting city. However,
I've immediately changed my mind.
Listen, guys, thanks a million for coming on and talking a very, very wide-ranging discussion there about the topic. I wish we had more time to go into more detail. But boundlesshq.com, isn't that the website?
That's it, yeah.
Okay. And you can catch Ellie's articles daily on independent.ie or in the Irish Independent. And you can also catch some of my articles in independent.ie as well, sometimes in the Sunday Independent or the Irish Independent. And you can also catch me here every week on Friday and indeed throughout the week, because that's how podcasts work. So for me, Adrian Weckler, tech editor of the Irish and Sunday Independent, thanks again for listening, and I'll talk to you next week. Bye-bye.